We have two lectures. I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director, and welcome to the second night of lectures by this year's Architectural League Emerging Voices. Each year, the League selects 8 emerging practices based in the United States, Canada, or Mexico through a juried invited portfolio competition. The award recognizes individuals and firms with distinct design voices and the potential to influence the discipline of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism through their realized work, as well as their accomplishments in community, taking into account everything from publications and design awards to their role in academia and advocacy. You can find further information about each firm on the League's recently redesigned website. It just relaunched a week ago, and I really encourage you to visit. It is just beautiful and is containing additional information by the week. There are additional features on each firm. Some of them have launched, including features on the 2 firms tonight, and there'll be features on each of the subsequent firms, as well as videos of the lectures and roundtable discussions that we hold with the firms after the lectures. So keep visiting. Before I introduce Sunil Bald, who is a past winner and one of this year's jurors, and he'll introduce tonight's speakers, I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who make this series possible. First and foremost, Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown for their ongoing enthusiasm and generous support. The Architects newspaper for another year of just really amazing coverage of the program. It's in their February-March issue. We're giving them away, so if you didn't pick one up on your way in, you can pick one up on your way out, and you can always find the features on their website too. The Mexican Cultural Institute, who've helped us with some travel this year. Additional support for the series is provided by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and by the Next Generation Fund of the Architectural League, which is an annual fund, more or less, supported by a group of past emerging voices and League Prize winners, sort of paying it forward to the next generation. Architectural League programs are also supported in part by public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. For those of you who were here last week, I'm sorry that this is sort of repetitive, but I'm going to say again how we choose emerging voices. There can be a kind of opaqueness to some of our programs, especially this one versus the League Prize, which is an open call for entries. Emerging voices are selected each year through a multi-step process, which begins with research by the League staff in concert with a big network of past emerging voices, journalists, curators, and others to compile a list of candidates who are invited to submit a sample of their work, a CV, and a text outlining their design philosophy. And this year, we expanded the jury to include past emerging voices winners from across North America, who reviewed work from approximately 50 firms to select a group of finalists who are invited to submit full portfolios. And then there's a second round jury in New York of New York-based architects who choose 8 winners. The first round jury included Virginia Sanfratello, Sebastian Smalling, Wani Ix, Lola Shepard, Marcello Spina, whose idea it was to expand the jury nationally, Carlos Jimenez and Marlon Blackwell, as well as members of the second round jury, who are primarily, as I mentioned, based in New York, Stella Betts, Lisa Gray, Jing Liu, Paul McCoskey, Tom Pfeiffer, Chris Reed, Billy Chen, and Sunil Bald, who will introduce tonight's speakers. So thanks for coming.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I just have to see if it's better with or without my glasses. Okay, I guess with. So my name's Sunil Bald, and I've had the good fortune to be on the Emerging Voices jury for 3 years now. And each of these juries has its own character, even if, like me, there are many of the same characters on the jury for consecutive years. So the differences from year to year are more attributable to the moment, the context in which we are seeing the work, than the actual people on the jury. Sometimes that context is reflective of the state of the discipline. Sometimes it's reflective of the state of practice. But this year, the context that framed our deliberations just seemed way larger. In short, we were engaged by work that instrumentalized both discipline and practice to explicitly challenge the complexities and insanity of our socio-political moment, and hopefully it's a passing moment. Each year, we're encouraged to look for the voice of the emerging voice finalists. The voices of agency and Fernanda Canales did indeed speak to us with strength, rigor, and grace. However, their respective voices might be better understood as agendas, not just relayed through the objects they make, but in the sites these two firms impact. In the work of each, we saw a clear conviction that architecture can be an instrument of change. One of tonight's practices operates at the border, the other in an expanded field. However, today the border is arguably a center, while the field is riven with its own borders, boundaries, and thresholds. The respective works of agency and Fernanda Canales embrace these complexities, formulating sites of engagement through objects and assemblies of power and beauty. So, can I have this water? Thanks. So tonight, we'll first hear from Ersela Kripa and Stephen Mueller of Agency. Ersela and Stephen both graduated from Columbia with master's degrees and then worked and taught in New York for a few years before winning the Rome Prize in 2010. So with their collective pedigree, they could have pretty much gone anywhere. But they've chosen to live and work on the edge in El Paso, Texas, steps from the border, a charged context, but one of opportunity in alignment with their interests and their agenda. Agency's projects explore the relationship between the immaterial and the material. In their work, materiality is perhaps better described as assembly rather than object, assemblies of parts that activate assemblies of people. And it's through these assemblies that the material, that architecture, engages the immaterial. What they make act as loci, harnessing the strength of the cultural and social forces that can form a collective and consequently challenge the forces that seek to control. So with this, Ersela and Stephen.
All right. Hello. Start my timer. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. The Architectural League. Thank you to Anne and the juries and Sunil for that incredible introduction. We recorded it, so we'll play it again on our ride home, on our flight home. So as you heard, we're Agency, and we will talk a little bit about our research and our built work today, and really make the connection of how the research informs what we make. In our practice, we work to identify and transform emerging urban paradigms in order to enable the production of new forms of public space. As both researchers and designers, we embrace confrontational roles in order to create objects, forms, spaces, databases, and arguments which instrumentalize spatial justice. Our interdisciplinary practice engages shifts in contemporary culture through architecture, urbanism, and advocacy. And our projects range from media environments that you'll see some today, material assemblies to guerrilla installations and infrastructures without permission, and sort of standard architectural projects in order to sort of raise public awareness and create sort of campaigns around our projects. And so you will see territorial tactics today. So while our thinking is that while territories shape forms, we argue that forms can also reciprocate and shape territories.
So as Sunil mentioned, we live in practice in a context that's literally steps away from the US-Mexico border, where we find public space and public life is continually threatened. Here you see a shot of a nearby region. This is literally just a few minutes from where we live and work. On the left, you see a part of Ciudad Juarez. Running sort of diagonally there, you see the international border fence separating it from New Mexico. Here, vast geographies are defined by an all-encompassing and pervasive security apparatus. We read this particular environment as a kind of bellwether for transformations that are nascent throughout American cities. And for us, it's also a peripheral testing ground for novel security technologies which are soon to transform the domestic interior. Despite these threats, our practice crafts opportunities for new publics to emerge, reclaiming a space for public discourse and debate. So first, we craft objections, targeting the underconsidered aspects of the built environment that put human lives and human rights at risk. We transform objects, as Sunil just thoughtfully described, orchestrating unexpected spatial effects that leverage the economies of ready-mades, of byproducts, and of efficient custom assemblies we design ourselves. All to articulate objectives which advocate and provide the space for new public encounters.
Our public spaces are under attack. The political fora of generations past are no longer arenas that sponsor agonistic discourse, but are now sanitized spaces for the replication of self-insulating ideologies. Our world is shaped by securocratic regimes. Everywhere wars on drugs, on terror, and poverty subsume large territories that are poorly defined in the name of security. Boomerang effects abound. The spatial technologies replicating from the edges of empire, they come back home to the heart of the homeland. Monitored, surveilled, and patrolled, the public realm of the contemporary city has become a victim of spatial instruments of suppression, both foreign and domestic, both from private industry and security interests. Even existing cities have been co-opted into playgrounds for the world's military.
Our research is collected in our current book. We're finishing up shortly, should be available soon, we hope, which is called Fronts, Security in the Developing World, which further explores these territories and helps to define new invisible geographies that operate within them. In our research, we find that the measure of a place is no longer neutral, but is seen as an index for intervention. The shapes, the textures, and the patterns of city streets and blocks, homes, and offices are scanned and evaluated routinely for threats by security and military forces, but also by logistics. Threats to commercial delivery and unmanned vehicles are seen sort of side by side with threats from violent non-state actors. Our spaces are scanned for conflicts with the principles of control. Formal building records and codes are mirrored in what we call the countercode of global security, which indexes which urban assemblies are most desirable, which are most easily monitored, weaponized, and patrolled. Abnormalities within this field are associated with a kind of criminality and creates what we call a kind of morphometric targeting system. The surfaces of the city are seen to either help or hinder a potential attack. What the military calls intrasurfaces and subsurfaces are cataloged exhaustively. High-fidelity virtual replicas of cities are instantly gleaned from partial satellite imagery. We wonder who will be listening to and intercepting this data, and for what purposes will these morphometrics be deployed? At Agency, we seek to both identify but also interrupt these forces.
And we should say the images you're seeing are military drawings, but also these are physically built, simulated environments built for urban warfare training. The military has co-opted the city as a space for training, foreshadowing the future of insurrections. They arrive unannounced, sometimes in civilian neighborhoods that fit their models as hotbeds of likely resistance. So where we are in the desert, we countermap these dedicated sites of urban simulation and their morphometric targeting. These are entire cities built from scratch in the middle of the desert. And we scrape government documents and construction contracts in order to uncover the coordinates and morphologies of over 500 of these shadow sites. We are creating the first radically transparent geospatial database of these maps, and the idea is to make them available when the book comes out. So we are looking at military simulated urban environments, global migration and detention sites, occupied waste sites and extraction landscapes, and conflict and humanitarian aid locations. And the reason we're remapping the world in this way is that these maps to us reveal this transnational geography that shapes our world more directly than the remnants of the nation state. Entire constellations of cities and city-like forms are indexing shifts in power. And the forms that are simulated and trained for are sort of predominantly what we're interested in, especially with the book. We're identifying these commonly targeted urban and architectural features, recognizing that these sites end up telegraphing the future of war. And in El Paso, we've been fortunate to gain access to many of these sites and in order to uncover and write their secretive histories. We hear horror stories of the lengths the securocratic regime is willing to go to ensure realism in training. Refugees are employed as role players in order to relive the horrors of the war they left behind, or corpses of unclaimed homeless are considered briefly as part of the scenery to enhance the smells simulation in cemeteries. And so in our research, the commonly occupied typologies of the training sites, we're studying also the graphic language of training. This military has this kind of very interesting way of drawing spatial references, even things like smells or where encounters might happen. And we are co-opting this language in order to invent a counter code against this kind of penetrability. And by identifying the largest informally occupied areas like dumps, camps, and graveyards that might be targeted, we're finding ways to redraw these sites in order to project their near future scenarios. And we're calling these securocratic timeshares that were packed and shipped in military kind of crate and were sent to the Shenzhen Hong Kong Biennale, the one 2 years ago, as these sort of dead territories that pay homage to sort of the tested environments within this kind of arts biennial context.
So in our research and our projects, we try to embed ourselves within the contexts that we're interested in, which are often the overlooked or the neglected corners of our everyday environments. For a year in Rome, we engaged with the Rome and Sinti communities, studying the forced displacement of communities in over 200 informal settlements within the boundaries of municipal Rome. We inhabited the periphery in order to unpack the logics of the informal settlements and the counter logics of the municipal government, which at the time was forcibly relocating these inhabitants. Settlements for decades have occupied the liminal space of the city, the leftover spaces on the edges of infrastructures. They're subject to systemic disenfranchisement, which uprooted families, many of whom had Italian citizenship, moving them away from informal economic opportunity, from transportation, from education, schools for their children. We uncovered through our work a cynical scheme by the city officials to ensure the demolition and the construction contracts for the resettlement camps, which they called, not ironically, solidarity villages. These spaces were more like modern-day concentration camps, which were constructed by the municipal government. They were exurban enclaves which were surveilled and monitored by private security firms 24 hours a day, where other Italian citizens were not allowed in, where arbitrary curfews were set, and residents lived behind fences and behind barbed wire. Here they were far from city services and they fell victim to neglect, both infrastructural, but also personal violence. They were subject to arson and even government-sponsored demolition just months or years after the camps were constructed. These environments for us presented an alternative to the historic center of Rome, which is far away from tourist eyes. We played our part, leveraging our architectural training in order to bring an economic and logistical argument to city officials and the public at large in order to expose and combat the systemic institutionalized racism and human rights abuses that we saw in these camps. We geolocated the camps to identify the most and the least permissive municipal districts. We codified each settlement based on its security of tenure to identify the most insecure among them. And we developed a timeline to contradict the official narrative of migration of this community, showing that much of the perceived migration was actually an optical illusion perpetuated by the local police force and municipal government, caused by the forced governmental evictions. We began to see and to help the public see that the camps were actually a networked assemblage of the continuously displaced. We unpacked the history of systemic spatial violence within the scenario, which hinged first on a linguistic and then a legal distinction on how the Roma occupied space. Anti-Roma policy actually dated back to a false equivalency which was made, written into law, that associated the Roma with, quote, nomadic culture. The presence of nomads later, borrowing on this precedent, was deemed a national emergency in 2008 and had since been renewed a number of times, making an equivalency between a population and the presence of a national or natural disaster. This is actually the first time in Italian history where the presence of a population had the same sort of bearing on national policy as something like an earthquake or a hurricane. This then enacted a state of exception which authorized the construction and demolition contracts for the camps with limited oversight, and also enabled and supported police action for this demolition. So we worked to identify the location of the secretive camps and gain access through our sponsors, cataloging the planned evictions and the reconstructions, giving these spaces a kind of name and geography. We presented the work in exhibitions and public lectures and to city officials. Here you see an exhibit for the Academy community in Rome, and here abroad at Sofia Architecture Week.
And back at home in the U.S., as was mentioned, we live and practice on the U.S.-Mexico border. And after the recent presidential election, we felt that we absolutely needed to give the region sort of a different kind of microphone that broadcasts the reality of sort of the binational culture on the ground beyond the border wall rhetoric. And so we've been writing this series we're calling Border Dispatches for the Architect's newspaper that's coming out every month. And the idea here is to continue to write the histories of all of the the devices of the securocratic regime that actually render the border what it is. And so we're looking at simulated border fences used by Border Patrol agents to train, or sort of mock ports of entry. This is actually a Mexican port of entry in a very small town in the Big Bend National Park. And of course the detention centers where these entry ports and these detention centers in the U.S. have become, are mapping a series of these shadow logistics infrastructures. And they are run for profit by private contractors in very remote juridical environments where they actually exploit their off-the-map status in order to disenfranchise detainees. So the current president has been flying judges to the detention centers to judge on cases so that the detainees don't have access to not-for-profit attorneys or other kind of legal aid away from urban centers. And in 2009, the DHS itself actually criticized these facilities, saying that the ICE facilities are used to detain aliens are built and operated as jails and prisons, and the standards impose even more restrictions that are absolutely necessary. And they are built in prisons, rendering sort of an architectural type complicit in this inhumane treatment. Many of these sites of detentions are not privately operated by firms and individuals who actually came up in the penal system. So the jail warden is now sort of the person who oversees detainees. And with this profit-driven model, selected sites are becoming more highly specialized, and they become a network of nodes in this national business of deportation. And one site that we visit, and we've been interviewing people there, the Otero County facility has become a glorified departure gate for a secretive airline shuttle service that's run by Customs and Border Patrol. And it sends about 160 detainees to Mexico 3 times a week, regardless of where they came from. And so organizers describe these kinds of spaces because they know we're architects, and they talk about the success of the architecture in processing not people, but they call them bodies. So sort of any given room or lobby, if it can process about 150 people given a day, then that's successful. But also you can see that these environments are practically sort of correctional facilities.
So while we engage the state at its margins, we also work to identify emerging non-state forms and the spaces that are associated with them. We dissect and advocate for new post-national forms which are rooted in cities as loci of local but weak power. And we look to military and security theory in order to understand this. One term that caught our attention is the so-called feral city. Feral city operates outside the rule of law, within an otherwise functioning state. A feral city is often ruled by the militia, by paramilitary, or other non-state actors. These non-state actors could be violent non-state actors like terror groups. They could also be relatively benign, an NGO or humanitarian aid organization. Military theorists categorize feral cities based on the institutions and the services that remain intact within them. In the most severe cases, the feral cities have reinstitutionalized along the lines of criminality, developing sophisticated criminal enterprises with global connections, interconnected in a web of economic and security alliances with other feral cities. Pirate networks and transnational cartels move arms and resources fluidly through this feral network. So we work to uncover this emerging geography, which is currently relegated to the margins and the anecdotes of military theoretical texts. And the images that you're seeing are images from an exhibit and an ongoing research which seeks to build some legitimacy for the feral, to actually use the tools of state building in order to construct a kind of alternative history to this otherwise imposed designation. We find evidence of the feral designation in other forms. The feral city, it turns out, has many names, and we've heard them all in the news in the last several years. No-go zones, cartel cities, sanctuary cities, vigilante cities, ungoverned territories. Low-income, dense, and informal environments are rebranded as terror dens, as safe havens, as breeding grounds. They are areas to be patrolled, surveilled, their infrastructure stamped out, their inhabitants rooted out. We develop an online database which shows the growing spread of designated ferality. Here we're scraping State Department travel warnings, journalistic accounts, and other military and security theoretical texts in order to understand this not yet visualized but very prevalent form of geography. We find that feral sites are designated often in direct contradiction to lived experience. Ciudad Juarez, our neighbor to the south in El Paso, is a recurring feature of feral cities doctrine. It's been called a wolf at the door of the US, despite in recent years rapidly stabilizing its societal indexes and decreasing its crime rates. Also of note, New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina and St. Louis during the Black Lives Matter protests were actually given the most extreme designation of ferality, meaning, according to military theorists, they had reinstitutionalized along the lines of criminality. The Molenbeek neighborhood and countless other ex-urban peripheries throughout the world are the subject of travel warnings and fill out this geography. So we're interested in this kind of urban scarlet letter, which perpetuates the removal of these areas from civil society. And on feralfederation.org, we've made this data public in order to gain a kind of window into this new constituency of the cities and their citizens which have earned this designation. And clicking through the online database, you can understand new relationships between when they were designated, who designated them, for what reason.
And so through the research, we're also, because we're architects, we're interested in the material rituals of the sort of the military training environments. We've mapped a collection of sites that actually study the resistance of the built form to military training and intervention. And so if this is a standard sort of building of construction types kind of chart that we look at for use, the military is actually looking at it in order to understand from the perspective of a weapon and a target and the kind of material resistance that architecture might provide. And so different constructions provide different types of opportunities for amplifying or depleting military force. And this is a site, Playas, in New Mexico, where we spend also a lot of our time. Buildings here, these are sort of standard suburban American homes. This was a former copper mining town that sort of completely declined and everyone left, and now it's being used for training. And so these buildings actually become sort of selectively demolished by various breach attempts in order to understand that different types of constructions provide different types of resistance to weapons. And even things, very domestic things like doors, become this prime site of study for combat engineers and explosive experts who actually determine the swing and the hinge type in order to conceive the best place to detonate charges. And so different doors and different materials require different approaches for breach training. And so these sites end up stockpiling doors, but we look at them as this kind of material sacrifice that is repeatedly used for training. And the site manager, who's a former Marine, he's become a friend of ours, and he's very eager to share their findings. And so we're the proud owners of 6 of these are doors that we own. And we take them on road trips, and we took them to Hollywood for an exhibition at WUHO, and sort of catalog them in this kind of gallery setting. But the idea is to sort of to kind of understand the typologies of sort of entering and how that very directly intersects architecture. So things like doorstops are holding these doors, as you can see up on top in the walls. I guess right there, which was really funny for us. But sort of taken out of context, there's a very sort of disturbing idea of thinking of a typology of breach and how one might not find security in their own home.
So we're interested in the spaces of conflict, in spaces of protest and police encounter. Police actually reclaim a very precise space, a 21-foot boundary around potentially aggressive bodies, which legitimizes the use of lethal force within a circumscribed, ambiguous, and mobile territory. Anyone within this 21-foot range is recast as a potential suspect in a kind of ongoing error in our police training mechanism. So within 21 feet is the distance that a potential armed assailant would be able to traverse in the time, quicker than the time it would take an officer to unholster his or her weapon and immobilize the attacker. So within this space, our police are trained that they're within a space that might authorize the use of lethal force because it poses mortal danger. So violence here is a presumed mode of interaction. By designing this space, we wonder if we might mitigate the violence that takes place within it. We propose a spatial framework that amplifies the problematic metrics of de-escalation, and we offer this as a counter-narrative to a site here in New York City, which is the home to will soon be the home to a police precinct. But we propose a national de-escalation training center to train abusive officers to leave the force.
And so we will show 4 projects very quickly that sort of more directly answer this question of how does the research actually inform the work, or the so what question. And so we are always looking, or we're designing small objects that distill the larger issues of the research, but that as objects in themselves, they can sort of inscribe and control vast territories. In Albania, which is where I'm from, a community of informal garbage pickers moves through the garbage every day to collect recyclables. And so this kind of strikes us as a pretty sad way of working. And so through some quick research, we realized that they play a vital role in recycling networks and waste collection all over Europe. And we also realized that the municipal government does not have any funding to enact formal recycling infrastructure. And so while the current practice forces these people to sift through organic waste with their own hand, and this would be the ideal, unattainable future of sort of source separation, we wondered whether we can actually offer an interim intervention, a Band-Aid solution that we understand is not a real solution, but it's a way to kind of make their picking easier so they don't have to sift through organic matter. And so we're on vacation, so we had €200 to spare. And so we worked with a local artist who had a welding shop, and we made these covers. We spray painted them as the fun, recognizable recycling kind of covers. And we guerrilla installed them all over the city without permission because we knew it would take time, and there's no way to classify this thing as a thing, as an installation or whatever this might be. And so, but the municipal worker here on the left really believed in this, and so she also helped us against probably her orders. And we installed it and kind of walked away and started to document how people might behave around this. And sure enough, the waste bins that had the covers collected all of the recyclables, and the ones that didn't collected the organic matter. And so what this does is it speeds up and kind of creates a slightly more hygienic environment in which to pick through recycling. And we always document sort of our performance through these kinds of architectural sections. And the most fun part was that we created a fake company, and we sort of blasted this on social media and asked people where they would like to see this installed next. It picked up steam, and the U.S. Embassy actually called us in, wanting to know who we were and what is this that we're doing. And they're interested in sort of funding a larger educational campaign about separation at the source that would sort of render this recycling a little bit easier.
So now we've moved to El Paso, Ciudad Juarez region, where we really live our practice. We really find it important and rewarding to actually inhabit the kind of territories that we're interested in inflecting. We're now in one of the most surveilled and patrolled regions in the world, at the site of one of the largest binational metropoli in the Western Hemisphere. So what you're looking at is actually El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. The buildings in sort of the midground are downtown El Paso, and immediately behind you see the development of Ciudad Juarez with the Juarez Mountains in the far distance. We teach actually at a sort of satellite outpost of Texas Tech University, which is here in an active train station. We're no more than about 50 yards from the U.S.-Mexico border, which is defined here as an international border fence. And in this view, you can see the same sort of divided yet connected territory that we're in, with Ciudad Juarez in the immediate midground.
And so in this context, it's as you can imagine, it's a highly controlled environment. So when we first came and started crossing to Juarez often, we realized that Border Patrol agents and these traffic barrels are actually the sort of soft infrastructure that enact binational policy. Regardless of what binational policy might be at the DC level, on the ground, these traffic cones change daily in order to accommodate traffic routes and volumes in rush hour, let's say. And so we realized that these guys are the sort of like the soldiers of these sort of policies, or the national policy. So we were wondering what it would be like to arrest these soldiers and to kind of to take them out of commission. So we found out who the company is that rents these out to the DOT. And we wanted to see how many we can take out or we can use. And so they lent us 256 of them for 2 days. And that's all they could spare, because these are very valuable where we live. And so right behind our school where we teach, we have this amazing piece of infrastructure, which used to be the bus stop for buses that would connect El Paso and Juarez in the past. And so with our fantastic students, I should mention, they're all binational, bicultural, and 30% of them live in Juarez, and they cross daily to study with us, so they're total rock stars. And they're game with us. Whatever we want to do, they're there. And so we took these cones, or they were delivered to us, and we figured out that because we're working with very low resources, as any installation is, low budgets and constraint timelines, we designed a way to make construction foolproof. So this is where we actually sort of engage sort of smart software and algorithms and calculated the chain lengths so that an object or an installation made by many hands in a community together of unskilled labor can actually have access to constructing something together. And it was error-proof. And so you see this cloud that is sort of very precisely calibrated, more or less, and sort of engaging not only the sky but also the ground. And we essentially arrested the barrels that enact these kind of restricted policies, both on the sky and in the ground. And we were able to kind of stage this sort of occupation of infrastructure for 24 hours in these very strange juxtapositions where we have our image in the front, and then that's the border highway you see, and those are the Juarez Mountains, and the police wondering what it is that we're doing. But during the night, the reflectivity and the materiality of these barrels actually became something that we were fascinated with, and it sort of reflectivity became the theme of the evening. And we staged a Beaux-Arts ball where our students, we asked them to show up as the estranged human that this kind of infrastructure of control might kind of engage or might insinuate. And so one of our students really sort of lived with this idea of sort of, you see them here installing very quickly, and then the sort of the ground becomes another kind of inhabited space through these ephemeral shadows that go away quickly. And then this is one of our students that became sort of this sort of infrastructural remnant with a pipe in her head, sort of being part of this kind of celebration of taking power back from infrastructure.
So with the design work, what we hope to do is to take some of the issues that are made visible or sort of present by the research and to collapse them into a real physical experience, often through the design of a discrete object or a series of objects that have some of the qualities of assembly that were discussed earlier. With our Selfie Wall project, we work to create a public space which highlights data privacy concerns. The unprotected excessive sharing of photography online has really expanded the reach of the surveillance apparatus beyond any clear sort of legal boundary. Data scrapers and security bots are increasingly using facial recognition software to map an individual's location, which can both determine their mood, but also the mood of an entire city or an entire location in space. And these softwares and these applications can actually begin to forecast action and sort of predetermine kind of counter action. As our data becomes available to the highest bidder, we think that new protection protocols might be necessary. So we look to coerce this behavior in public in order to ultimately undermine it. We appropriate the forms of stage and photography lighting, the barn doors or the umbrellas or the reflective screens that you see on films and TV sets. And we make them our own by designing a custom unit which bounces and scatters both natural and artificial light in order to provide a kind of photographic environment. The units are actually composite aluminum panels that are flip milled. They're quite easily assembled like a paper model. They become structural and rigid when the loop piece that you see in the top pieces meets the cross towards the bottom. The whole process here takes about 5 minutes and is distributed labor with a minimum of skill needed. There's over 150 units of about 16 different types. And here you can see the units migrate from being a sort of purely structural unit that provides a lot of openness and an aperture, the so-called structural cross, to a more sort of broad-faced umbrella form that is able to shape the natural light. The form of the project is structural bent. It's basically one wall, one surface to provide a kind of background. At the meeting of the two legs of the project, we flip the pattern and we open the apertures to create what we call voyeur portals, which makes the private action of self-photography radically public to the outside. We study this and develop it, as we do most of our projects, by overlaying sort of compound logics. Structural concerns and aesthetic effects are studied in tandem in order to design the units. This shows the LED array on the inner side of the installation, which moves from a white to a warm white set of tones in order to be flattering to various skin tones. People migrate up and down the wall in order to find their most flattering light. We like to call this a kind of Instagram filter in real life. On the outside, the LED array moves from white to cool white. So here you have an opportunity for a more accurate color rendition for your portrait. We embed laser-cut foam pieces, which we call soft bellies, within the hard shell of the composite aluminum unit. These help to diffuse the light for the nighttime array, creating a soft glow as you would have in a vanity fixture. The space of the project creates these opportunities for both play and surprise. Here you see some children looking through some of the portals at their mother inside. The private act of self-photography thus is made public, and we invite people to make critical decisions about how public their photography will be. The Selfie Wall allows for both recognizable and undetectable photography for the data scraping algorithms. The user is free to choose between a clear photograph when facing the wall and a darkened, backlit, color-filtered one, which obscures their features when using the wall as a background. We actually found, for maybe not for data privacy purposes, but the photos that had the wall in the background were by far the most popular. But the project was used at the beginning of a public education campaign about the dangers of online sharing. So we developed an online platform which collected the hashtags of selfies taken within the wall on site during this temporary installation and projected them real time on a digital screen on the site. And we had a team of volunteers explain the process of metadata collection to the selfie takers in hopes of rendering them aware of the ease and the speed of surveillance collection from this seemingly innocuous act.
And so we had, over the weekend, we had about 2,000 selfie takers, and most of them are really willing to hashtag, knowing that they would actually be geolocated. And so when we talked to them about sort of the projections and the dangers of online sharing, half the people cared and half actually weren't really worried about it. And then selfie yoga showed up one weekend we didn't know about. And it was about sort of focusing on yourself, I guess, you assume. And so with this last project, we are just so excited about it. And this is where we're thinking of the idea of taking the territory to the stratosphere, and you'll see why we are collaborating with a geologist on it. This is an image of transcontinental or sort of global dust migration. Where we live is the Chihuahuan Desert, which transcends obviously the political border, and so this desert actually is sort of part of the environment we live and breathe. And so right now we're in dust storms. We're in sort of windy season in El Paso, so we say that we ingest Mexican dust every day. So from our window we actually see the inversion in the morning, and then that dust makes it. We have an El Pasoan who's saying yes, that's what happens. But what we're interested in is the kind of infrastructure this kind of dust or these events enact. As a sort of this becomes an infrastructure of fear and of monitoring. These are sort of air quality and dust monitoring stations all along the U.S.-Mexico border. And what is primary here is this idea of fear, of the unknown that the dust might hide or might take with it. So, agricultural terrorism is a real issue that the Homeland Security Department is looking at, or even ways that it could be weaponized with, sort of unmanned vehicles and drones and things like that. And so we were able this past winter to sort of beta test another idea. What if we can actually understand and measure the amount of dust and the pollution in the air we breathe daily? That information is not available where we are. It's mostly sort of available in terms of threat or security. And so we spent a month in Hong Kong, Shenzhen, looking as part of a sort of a residency for New Cities, Future Ruins at the Biennale. And the idea was to understand air quality and to figure out on our own whether or not we could just measure this and understand data. And so we made our own dust sensor, you see on the left, sort of MacGyvered it in a travel pouch. And we sort of had this ritual of 8-hour walks every day along the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, which is still very highly controlled, to measure the air quality on the ground. The problem is that the US State Department releases air quality index for China every day, and so does the Chinese government. But none of that information is actually accurate. And obviously, because it's the air we breathe, that affects people's lives. People are dying because they don't understand what they're breathing. They don't have access to this data. And so we found a way to turn the numeric data of the sensor into these kinds of graphs that start to depict new topographies of the water border as sort of these densities of pollution. And we presented this at the Biennale, and we had actually people who were looking at the spikes in the graphs and just were really worried. But the idea was to really uncover the deltas in what the U.S. considers as danger levels of dust pollution in the air versus what the Chinese government considers as dangers, which is a lot more relaxed, but also versus the reality on the ground. And so we made this we geolocated all of our walks in order to sort of very real-time catalog where this dust quality is. And part of our ongoing interest in sort of making or finding ways that many hands of unskilled labor can make together is this idea of creating an algorithm that takes the dust data and turns it into sort of orders for stitching, potentially by a robotic arm. Somewhere in Taiwan, we're not sure yet. But the idea is that these are fabric filters that are meant to filter dust, but they will actually be sort of embedded with these glitches that actually measure the dust of their neighborhoods. So these are urban fabrics of the neighborhoods where we measured from and where we sort of gleaned these logics from. And then the most exciting part for us is that we're scaling it up. This summer, we're producing about 200 of these sensors, and we found a way to make them better and sort of more tamper-proof. And we will install in Anapra, which is a very underserved community here on the left, in Juarez, and on the other side is Sunland Park, which is also sort of underserved community across the border. 100 sensors will go here, 100 sensors will go there, and the idea will be to leave them up for about 4 months and to gather data at the breathing level where sort of these inhabitants and residents can actually, through a real-time app, understand the quality of the air that they're breathing. Because there's this kind of disjunction between the highly surveilled and cataloged air environment, the thick air environment above us, for security purposes, and then there isn't any kind of data available to the human on the ground that this air quality actually affects. And this air quality here is rampant because of not only desertification, but the free economic zone that has been booming in Juarez due to the maquiladoras and the sort of the low-cost assembly line factories. And so we are collaborating with a geologist who will also launch a balloon that measures dust from the ground to the stratosphere. So this kind of continent of dust in the sky, we're very excited to think of our territory of practice from the sort of the surface of the Earth to the stratosphere. And so we'll be measuring all summer. But you can see that the conditions. This is Anapra in Mexico. That this is a city built in the desert in sand. Completely informally, without any kind of other infrastructure than these poles, which will be where the dust sensors will be.
At Agency, we aggregate weak power.
We forge constituencies from disjointed assemblages.
We take things into our own hands.
And we operate in the margins and occupy liminal zones.
We're top-down and bottom-up.
We appropriate cultural and physical material.
We find advantage in apparent constraint.
And we amplify local success in order to mitigate systemic failures.
Agency is the particular cloaked in the generic.
And we inflect territory by tactical means. Thank you.